Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Good morning,
Good
Mr.
morning.
Graves. Yesterday, we had been looking through your report, which is SBPI 00667. And we had got to section 4, which was page 12. So page 12, section 4. And we moved on to start talking about some specific points that had been raised with you by the inquiry.
Yes.
And you will recall that I read out the questions which had been asked, and they were from A to H. And as was very kindly pointed out to me yesterday, my arithmetic was wrong. I said that was 7 and it's actually 8.
Yes.
And had started the process of going through those questions and looking at your views on those. And I think we were still on A, which was who was in charge. And we'll see that at page 13 of your report. And you'll remember yesterday we had been looking at the position in 2015. And then if we can move on to page 14, I'd like to move on to the 2022 position. And I think yesterday you explained that you'd been sent papers from 2022,
yes,
which were the most up-to-date papers, on the basis that further training in Police Scotland continues to evolve, and it hasn't stopped then, but the papers that you had were up to that date.
Yes.
So I'd like to look at what is paragraph 6 on this page, and in relation to the up-to-date position, if I can call it that, 2022, you said you were unable to find any specific documents showing current training or input on this matter. And this is the first matter that you were asked about, who's in charge.
Yes.
There is a new section in the 2022 OST manual, additional training around response to knife-related incidents. So you were able to talk about a new section, but hadn't found any specific documents even at that stage.
Yes.
Which showed specific training, which covered question A, which was who was in charge in relation to a response team attending a knife incident.
That's correct, yes.
Now, we have also a statement available for the chair from Inspector David Bradley, which is SBPI 00408. And if we could have that on the screen. And if we could look at paragraph 45, and we've heard evidence from Inspector Bradley, but this is his inquiry statement, paragraph 45, and this relates to training in relation to knife incidents. And he said, I've been asked whether there is any training for probationers or in recertification training in relation to who is in charge when a response team are sent to a knife incident. I can't speak to the specific training given to probationary officers as to who is in charge at a knife incident. It's not an area covered in operational safety training recertification, which focuses on the operational techniques to mitigate edged weapon threat.
Yeah.
So it would appear that, certainly from Inspector Bradley's statement and from your own research, is that there's no specific training on that particular question.
Certainly not within the operational safety training programme. As I said earlier, possibly within other training delivered certainly to probationary officers around major critical incident response, etc., or command structures.
And thinking about officer safety training, would you see any merit in introducing training in relation to the question of who was in charge?
Yeah, I don't see any harm in it being an issue that would be raised during the discussion and delivery of the lessons in relation to what would happen if, you decided to declare this as a major incident or a critical incident. what would happen, who would take charge, etc.
And we've heard from other witnesses who have talked about how training can be reinforced. There may be training in one area, but the same messages could be reinforced in other areas.
That's correct, yes. I mean, an example of that may be during a restraint lesson, talking about medical implications and then linking that to the requirement for first aid, CPR, recovery position, etc. Just refreshing the links to take you from one bit of training to the other.
And is there benefit to people being trained if they receive the same message more than once in, say, restraint training and spells training and other areas of training?
I would have to say yes, yes.
How does that help people being trained?
Well, it reinforces the message and it allows them to swap from one bit of training to another where something else might take over due to changes in the situation.
Does this help people understand the applicability of these principles in a number of different areas?
It can do, yes.
And then you were asked by the inquiry team if the training was fit for purpose. Now you've explained there's no OST training. And I think you said a review set against College of Policing document mentioned may be advisable to confirm the position.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could explain to the Chair what you mean by recommending a review set against College of Policing training.
As I say, because of the differences between Police Scotland training and training being delivered and resources being used across the rest of the UK, I think it would be an advisable solution to just make that comparison. It may well be other training programmes outside of OST that are being used to support and get that message across, just to make sure that Police Scotland are mirroring that or have those other training programmes in place for officers outside of the OST programme.
So considering a review on the matter, yesterday you spoke about you can't simply add something in at the end. You've got to look at how it impacts the whole.
Yes.
If I can summarise it in that way. And is that something you would recommend with this question of who's in charge?
I think it would be a valid and useful exercise to conduct, yes.
Thank you. Can we go back to your report, please? And if we can go back to the page we were on, which I think was page 14. And we've just finished looking at number 7. Let's look at question 8. This relates to the hypothetical reasonable officer that we looked at yesterday. And if a hypothetical reasonable officer had received what is not, there's no training in OST, so it's very much dependent on other areas or perhaps experience. How would their actions potentially have differed in respect of a comparison with Police Scotland training in 2015? What you said in answer 8 is, firstly, I believe the risks would have been highlighted immediately by the ACR staff. Now, I believe more specific guidance would have been provided by ACR to the officers attending in relation to how they risk assess the incident and options available. And it would have included immediately updating ACR if subject was spotted. A hypothetical officer may give consideration as to observe and report rather than contact, subject to questions of public safety. The ACR inspector may give consideration to the deployment of an ARV or whether to assign an ARV. If an ARV was assigned, it would be kept running to the locus until cancelled by the officers at the scene. A local supervisor would have been assigned to take ground command of the incident from the ACR supervisor. But thinking about training and how that has or has not changed between 2015 and 2022, from reading your report, is it the case that really there's been very little change in the OST training since then?
Specifically in relation to this subject matter, yes, there's been very little update in relation to this, yes.
But you can see merit in having a review of that position.
I think so, yes. Other training packages have come in across the country. More training has been given to ACR staff and changes around risk assessment and bullet point reminders to give to staff deployed to these types of calls. The deployment guidelines for ARVs being assigned to knife-related incidents has been updated. So I think, yeah, that just bringing that information into OST as a mention in relation to specifically around knife incidents would be a benefit, yes.
And can you advise the Chair what's happening now in College of Policing in relation to this question?
Very similar. It's with certainly the bang up to date changes that are taking place currently across the rest of the UK. They're rolling out a new scenario-based PSST program, personal safety training, and that's very much scenario-based. And within those scenarios, mention of these, ancillary training requirements, these other bits of information are being fitted in, and there's an opportunity to discuss what would you do next or what would you do then, rather than just focusing on the standard techniques, etc., from the OST program.
And if there was to be any review of the training in this area, would you anticipate that they would have regard to the College of Policing up-to-date personal safety training initiative or changes?
As I say, I think it'd be a good place to start. The new process being rolled out is receiving very, very favourable feedback. It's being well received by officers on the ground, and it's changing the methodology of how we try to get officers to look at their de-escalation and communication skills, and taking that emphasis away from the reliability on equipment to resolve the problem.
And what is it that's changing?
Really, the whole training program has changed. It's now very much scenario-based. There's more emphasis on debriefing officers and getting officers to explain their decision-making process and justify their actions within those scenarios. And it's giving them an opportunity to practice in relative safety, but in a realistic format, what they might do in similar situations.
And is that because scenario-based training is viewed as being particularly helpful to people being trained?
Well, certainly from the College of Policing standpoint across the rest of the UK, that has been the findings from a sort of a 3-year plus review, looking at not just what officers think about officer safety, but speaking to trainers and strategic managers as well. And this new programme is the result of that work over the last sort of 3 to 4 years.
Thank you. And let me just be clear, it's PPST, is it?
Yes, personal and protection safety training.
Personal protection. Right. And I think you make reference to this on page 27 of your report. We don't need to have this on the screen, at the final paragraph H.
Yes, with my recommendation, yes, at the end.
We'll come on to that later. Thank you. So, if I may, I'd like to move on to the second question, which was B. And you'll see that on page 14 of your report, which we can see at the bottom of the screen, if we could bring that up. And it's officers' communications with ACR, including requirement for feedback when attending a grade 1 call. So this is focused on how officers communicate with the area control room and the requirement of providing feedback and information to the ACR. And you looked, first of all, at the 2015 position in Police Scotland. And this is an area where you describe it there as, there is nothing of note in the 2013 OST manual to advise officers on this.
No.
There is the cut principles, and we've heard evidence in the inquiry from officers about cut, which deals with knife incidents and provides guidance on best practice. And part of cut, one of the T's, is transmit.
That's correct, yes.
So I think the first T is transmit, and that is a signal to communicate with ACR, the control room.
ACR, other officers attending, etc., to spread the message, yeah.
And we also heard evidence that, as you say, that if an officer is using their radio, other officers en route will be able to hear, or any other officer tuned into that frequency.
That's correct, yes.
And you've said there this includes the transmit requirements to inform others that a subject is in possession of a knife.
Yes.
So that is a mechanism, a means whereby officers who see a subject with a knife can share that information widely with their colleagues and the ACR.
Yes, it's a two-pronged thing. One, it allows other officers, safety-wise, to understand that there's a knife involved in the situation, but also then transmits for support to come to the officers who are dealing with that incident.
Right. And probationer training in the use of radios was in place. So this is training that probationers receive at Tullyallen.
Yes, that's correct.
So they can come out of Tullyallen with a familiarity with radios and how to use them.
Yes.
And the various things they can do with them, because we've heard evidence at an early stage in the inquiry that it's not just simply a radio, it's got an emergency button and there's other ways of communicating. And then this is mentioned by Sergeant Andrew Park in his statement, along with a reference to the cut mnemonic. No other training appears to have been in place specifically on this subject. And so is it fair to say that really subject to this mention of transmit in the relation to the cut technique that's taught to officers, that there's no other specific guidance in the OST training which trains officers in communications with ACR and giving feedback to and from ACR?
Not specifically within the OST programme. It would be a matter of a learned procedure or a learned practice that you would report your arrival on scene, and you would provide updates when available and when practicable to actually assist other officers attending.
So is that about experience and years of service rather than specific training?
It could be, or as I've said before, with the ACR, I would expect a relevantly experienced ACR member of staff to possibly provide those prompts to the officer when they assign them to the call, something along the lines of, please report when your arrival, or please be aware of whatever, and giving them pointers and guidance on the call.
Now, we've heard evidence of something called, I believe from recollection, it was called a stay safe message. And officers gave their evidence to the chair about that was essentially a prompt to remind officers to stay safe. And we've also heard that it was expected in ACR that there would be feedback provided by officers at the scene.
Yes.
Because I think they were eyes on the ground. And in the absence of any CCTV, the ACR are very much dependent on the eyes on the ground and
yes.
the officers at the scene. And we've also heard evidence from a number of other officers that they maybe did not provide feedback to ACR. Many of them said things happened very quickly and they didn't provide feedback. But I wonder on your views about the fact that there's no specific training given on this, and whether, given the circumstances we've heard about, you think there might be merit in having some specific training incorporated into OST training about communicating with ACR?
Whether it's part of officer safety or it may sit outside of the actual remit, I think there's merit in officers being reminded of the requirements for that, whether that comes via a prompt from ACR as part of their training to officers, or whether it's a mention within OST. I certainly see the merit for that, for them to understand the importance of that T for transmit in such incidents.
And again, given what you've said earlier today, can you see benefit in, even if it does exist as training in other areas, that there's benefit in reinforcing that?
There's certainly no harm in it, and it wouldn't be an onerous task to add to certain scenarios or within the sort of the feedback to officers.
And I was just about to ask that, in scenario training, where an incident is taking place and officers are perhaps practicing in a safe environment a particularly difficult incident, would there be benefit in raising issues of feedback to the ACR?
It certainly would be a valid point to raise if you had the scenario was a knife-based one. You know, what would be the options and the tactical availability to the officers in relation to support? What type of support could they call on? The realities and practicalities of its arrival to assist you with that situation.
Is that the type of thing that could be a learning outcome for one of the trainers to identify? Is the officer, the trainee, probationer aware of the importance of feeding back to ACR?
Yes, it could be something as simple as discuss the merits of communicating with ACR, or discuss the numerics of the transmit from the cut mnemonic.
And is feeding back to the ACR really, is it something about safety? Keeping the police safe, the public and others?
Yes, it's very much geared around a safe approach to that situation, yes.
And obviously the cut principles or the cut mnemonic is something that many of the officers were aware of. Is that something that's taught regularly at either probationer training or refresher training?
Yes, it forms part of edge weapon inputs across the country, yes.
Let's look at question 2, which we see on the screen. With such a call, best practice would be to keep ACR and other officers attending updated on any safety-related issues. This would include initial contact with the subject, location, etc. What do you mean when you say initial contact with the subject?
So when you actually identify the subject and you know, locate them, you want to get past that location on as quickly as you can, so if other officers are attending, they can come to your location.
And then final line there, as I have been unable to find any specific reference to this being a priority within the training, it would appear it may have come down to experiential learning from others.
Yes.
So really, is this the importance of feedback, the reasons for feedback, the significance of that is really left to experience?
Yeah, learning on the job, basically.
Learning on the job. And presumably that learning on the job expects or anticipates that people will be perhaps responding to incidents rather than sitting at a desk-based job. So what for officers, for example, if they've maybe been in a more desk-based job or working in the community, if they are then sent out to, as part of a response team or to deal with an incident, and they don't have that experiential learning, they haven't learned on the job, would that cause you to have concerns?
It could, but they all get the same basic input regardless of where they're working in relation to the OST package. But yes, if they'd been off the streets for some time, or maybe hadn't, you know, are new to that particular role, there may be some learning for them to take place. Yes.
Right. And you see, that said, this should have been part of training input and or an SOP. As it is not, then I would suggest this was insufficient and left officers to decide when and what to communicate, leaving them vulnerable and increasing risk to them and their colleagues.
Yes.
And presumably also increasing risk to the public
Yes,
and
possibly.
to the subjects, potentially. Everyone could be at increased risk.
Yes.
Thank you. Can we consider what the position in 2015 was for College of Policing? So at paragraph 3, and you say here, the College of Policing position statement provides a response to, you mentioned the points and the page numbers. I am aware that within airwave radio training, probationary training and OST, there were various links to the importance of communication during incidents. Most ACR staff had drop-down lists of questions and points to ask officers attending that would appear on grade 1 calls. Within OST and the NPCC manual, similar guidance was given around best practice on knife incidents using the cut mnemonic. Now, leaving aside for the moment the ACR staff, because I understand that ACR staff in Scotland have drop-down lists and such like to prompt them.
Yes.
And that there is this stay safe message which is recognised and given by ACR. But thinking about the training that was provided in the College of Policing, you mentioned here the cut mnemonic and edged weapons for the College of Policing. Was there any more expansive training given by the College of Policing?
Not specifically, no.
Right. So the NPCC manual on edged weapons, was that very similar, really?
Very, very similar, yes. A little bit more in depth, and there was a whole section on edge weapons, but the information around the cut mnemonic is very similar and just emphasises the importance of that transmit once you've got yourself in a safe position. Yeah.
So was the position in Police Scotland in 2015 and College of Policing reasonably similar?
Yes, it was.
And can we look at College of Policing? Well, let's look at both the manual and another item. WIT 00115. So this is College of Policing documentation. So this is Module 13, Association of Chief Police Officers. And this is a College of Policing document that we see on the screen.
That's correct.
And if we can look at page 10, we should see something to do with cut and transmit. Now, page 10, that looked... Sorry, I don't see the page numbers here. Right, stop there, because I can see cut,
Yeah.
create distance, use cover, transmit. So it may be that we're inadvertently on the right page. There are a number of redactions in this document which
Yeah.
may make it slightly difficult to navigate on the screen. And it talks there about cut, and let's see if we can find the transmit section.
Should be the next page
It's
down.
maybe the next page, I think. Yes, if we can just... That's it. There we are.
And again,
Yes, there it is at
yeah.
the bottom of that page. Transmit or call for assistance in the conventional sense is the use of a personal radio to alert a control room to the current situation. This would be followed by the dispatch of suitable and appropriate resources as backup to the officer. Transmit can also mean a verbal warning to colleagues or members of the public.
Yes, shouting knife.
Yeah. And so there's some information about transmit, and making it clear it's not just to the ACR or otherwise, but no extensive, detailed explanation.
I mean, during the actual training discussion would probably be with that around the use of the emergency button to open the transmit facility and still allowing your hands free to deal with the individual should you need to defend yourself.
We've heard evidence that effectively turns into some sort of microphone.
It does. It opens the channel for and gives priority to that particular radio for about 15 seconds.
Thank you. And then if we could look at College of Policing COP 0003. Again, this is College of Policing training, and this was, if we can go down slightly so we can see the title. And this is Investigation PIP Level 1. What's PIP?
It's the PIP. It was the investigation sort of side of police training.
Right. And this was about responding to an incident.
Yes.
And if we could move, this is from, as I understand it, 2024.
Yeah.
So just the year, version 2, 2024. Sorry, 2014.
14. Yeah,
Sorry.
it's an older one.
Yes. So this is round about the same time as the 2015,
Yes.
2013 Police Scotland training. And if we could look at initial action on page 7, please, and paragraph 2.2. Responding to incidents. It's page 7. 2.2. Initial action at the scene of the incident. And we see APC down at the bottom. The acronym APC is a simple way to remember the fundamental steps for managing any crime scene, if we can move up, in 3 distinct phases. 1, assessing the scene of the incident. 2, protecting people and the scene of the incident. And 3, communicating details of the incident to control room staff.
Yeah, as I said, there's this thread sits amongst other training within the police world, and it's a sort of a standard practice to keeping the communication open and ACR informed of the development of the incident.
And then if we look at the next page, there's another paragraph. Nope. No, I don't see where it is, sorry. But I understand that there is some further details during this document talking about trainees should keep the Force Control Centre updated.
Yes, it's a bit further down. It's under the protecting the scene. It's the next sort of input
Sorry,
section.
thank you. I'm glad you know these documents. And it begins,
There
you
we go.
must keep the
Communicating with
force. There
others.
we are, communicating with others. Talks about effective communication being crucial. And you must keep the Force Control Centre, which would be the equivalent of ACR,
Yeah.
updated with details of the situation, who will arrange for any assistance you may require to be sent to the scene. Other agencies will also require information about the incident to enable them to operate as efficiently as possible. And they will need to know the location, your contact details, what has occurred to date, details of casualties, and an estimate of how the situation may develop. And is there benefit in explaining to people who are being trained that it's not just them? If they keep the equivalent of ACR involved, other people who can support them and protect them can be involved and attend the scene.
It is. I mean, it has to be linked with the practicalities of actually being able to transmit in the situation that they're in. A fast-moving, dynamic situation may delay that update, but as soon as it's practicable to do so, officers are encouraged to keep everybody updated of what's actually going on for their safety as well as the public and the subjects concerned.
Thank you. And so for the chair, considering the training that was in place at the time in 2015, and the lack of sort of distinct training in Police Scotland, if we've heard evidence that officers did not transmit or did not feel they had time to transmit and share feedback with ACR, so ACR did not have the information they were looking for from the officers on the ground, Do you have concerns about delays that would be built in because of that lack of feedback to ACR?
It certainly increases the risk and the danger to the officers who have made contact with an individual armed with a knife. The decision to send support and the time delay in that support arriving would again increase that risk. And I think purely, as an officer responding to something like that, I would want everybody to know what was going on for them to be able to get to me if I needed them. If nothing else, the exact location of where I am, so that they can get to me as quickly as possible.
And let's go back to your report, please, page 14. Or if we move on to page 15, actually, and look at paragraph 5 on page 15. And I think what you say here is, it's my opinion that a hypothetical officer would have provided an exact location for other officers attending, and they may also have informed them and others listening of their intention to engage this subject. So you're talking about a situation in 2015, even with the training as it was then in 2015 in Police Scotland and in similar training in College of Policing, you still consider that a hypothetical reasonable officer would still have provided feedback to ACR? Yes,
I mean, looking at the cut mnemonic, not just the transmit, the mnemonic talks about creating distance and using cover. So that intimates to an officer that the further away you are from an individual armed with a knife, the less risk there is to you. So if you make that conscious decision, or because of circumstances you end up in close proximity with that individual, the risks are greatly increased. Therefore, the requirement for backup possibly to be with you as soon as possible is paramount.
And that would have been the position even on the 2015 training?
Yes.
And let's move on to 2022, to a sort of more up-to-date understanding of training. And I think at paragraph 6, you've said from the training-related documents that you've reviewed, you've been unable to find any additional inputs specifically in relation to this matter, the feedback with the ACR.
Yeah.
Currently being delivered by Police Scotland. So you weren't able to see any real material change?
Yeah, there doesn't appear to be any update or any increase in that particular requirement. Yeah.
Right. And we've heard from, we have a statement from Inspector Bradley. Unfortunately, he has, I won't put it on the screen, but he's said he's talked about the up-to-date position to us in oral evidence as well, but he said he couldn't speak to specifics of probationer training on airwave syllabus, as that was out with his area of expertise, and he wasn't able to help us with any additional information about up-to-date training on that. So it looks like the position is reasonably similar to what it was in 2015.
It would appear to be, yes.
And in the College of Policing, what's the position there? Has that changed?
There has been some updates, and there are, as I said, other training programs in place now across the rest of the UK, certainly in relation to operational and tactical command, so understanding who's, go back to question A, who's responsible for what, and what those important things are that need to take place at initial arrival at a scene.
In relation to this issue, question B, which is, just to remind us all, is officers' communications with ACR, including the requirement for feedback when attending a Grade 1 knife call. Is this an area where you have any views on whether further improvements could be made by Police Scotland?
Again, as I say, I think as a thread, including that within scenarios or within feedback to officers in relation to their options, just highlighting the importance and the benefits of it would be a good thing, yes.
Thank you. And then could we turn now to question E, you'll remember when I spoke to you yesterday that I said there were 3 areas where you found no training or nothing of note, and I was going to deal with those first. So we will come back to C and D, but if we could look at E first of all. Now, this is, let's go back to section 4, which I think is on page 14, just so we can see, no, page 12. Let's just see where we are. So let's look at, we see it there. So issue question E, tactical options for approaching an individual reported to be on a public road carrying a knife. So we were looking at, and there were 4 tactical options that were addressed in evidence when you came and spoke to us before. And in areas where you didn't find any or little training of note, you identify Roman numeral 1, the rendezvous point, and 2, observe, wait, feedback, and 4, verbal dominance. Let's start with the tactical option number 1, rendezvous point. And if we could look at page 18 of your report. And we should see on page 18, E, tactical options 1, rendezvous point. It's towards the bottom of page 18. There we are. Let's begin with the training available in Police Scotland in 2015 on this issue. And you've mentioned that rendezvous point RVPs are normally associated with major or critical incidents, but they can be used as a tactical option to assist officers in dealing with situations. I've been unable to find any reference to RVPs in the training materials for normal frontline officers within the OST programme or any of the relevant documentation reviewed.
That's correct, yes.
So you weren't able to find any reference whatsoever?
No.
And you've then gone on to say, I would have expected RVPs to form part of the discussion around tactical options, most likely under observe and wait for support, when an officer might have assessed the risk as being too high to engage or go direct to a scene without support. But as I am unable to find any reference to this, I would say the training was lacking in this area. Officers may find the option of using an RVP useful when additional units or specially trained officers have been called to assist. The decision to set up an RVP can be made by the first officers on scene, by a supervisor or the ACR. So if we could look at that paragraph, please. You've been unable to find any reference at all, and so you feel the training was lacking. And was there anything in the documentation that you looked at that maybe didn't mention the words rendezvous point or RVP, but sounded like something similar to a rendezvous point?
As I mentioned around the create distance, the second point, the second question point, obviously the C in the cut mnemonic is create distance. As part of that input, discussion would be around observing an individual from a safe distance. So that might link across to that second question, but nothing in relation to having a set position where you would basically corral resources and officers for deployment from that RVP. Nothing I could find specifically on that.
So nothing specific. And would that require or rely on a particular trainer to maybe allow the probationers or the refreshing officers to make the connection between the creating distance and an RVP?
Yeah, if it wasn't brought up as part of the lesson, it wouldn't be immediately evident from the training materials.
We've also heard evidence that perhaps this is something that at least one of the officers was aware of from their own experience. So perhaps if they had experience in a number of years' service, they may have come across the use of an RVP.
Yes, I mean certainly any call where an ARV, an armoured unit, is being sent or responding to it, standard practice would be for them to request an RVP where to meet local officers. They would very rarely, unless safety matters are apparent, would go directly to the scene of an incident. They would normally want to meet up somewhere to be briefed and then deploy to the situation.
So if any officer, as part of a response team or in other circumstances, had been involved in an incident where an armed response vehicle was being called and attended, they may have been part of that RVP scenario.
Yes.
And there is some evidence available to the chair from a statement of Graham Patience, and I think if we can find that, that's SBPI 00385. And I'll come on to that in a moment, but I think that we have heard some evidence from one of the officers who talked about RVPs maybe being a possibility, and maybe being a possibility in the nearby public house, in the car park there. So the chair will be aware that at least one of the officers knew of the concept of RVP. Oh, excellent. We have this statement from Graham Patience. Now, we have a statement. Graham Patience has given a statement to the chair which says he was one of the trainers, instructors in around 2015. And if we could look at paragraph 138. He was asked if the following tactical options were taught during the recertification training in 2014-15 as it related to attending knife incidents. And he said, firstly, I am asked if remote rendezvous point was taught. Yes, an RVP. It's a commonly used tactic, basically for officers to group prior to engaging with somebody. Again, depending on the threat, it's not always the best option for everybody to go straight to the incident. It's a way for officers to kind of hot brief and have a quick discussion about resources, about who may do what and what tactics or what action they might take when they get there. So it's a meeting point prior to attending an incident. It's an often used tactic. And since we're here, I'll read the next passage, which will come on to slightly later. Secondly, I'm asked if observe, wait and feedback was taught. I would say so, yes. It's not something that would specifically be taught in OST or anything. It's not really applicable to the OST programme. Along with RVP, it's not something that we would teach, but again, it's basic policing techniques, I would say. And then at 140, I am asked if it is not applicable to OST, when would it be taught? That's a good question. Not something that I would be able to put my finger on. It's more of an instruction, really. Certainly things like meeting at an RVP or staying back and giving feedback, it would be something that would probably be instructed over the radio at the time by a supervisor or something like that. It's not really something that would be instinctive, I would say. Yeah. So we have a statement from Graham Patience. When he's asked the specific question at paragraph 138 about whether the following tactical options were taught during recertification, and he specifically deals with the issue of RVP, he says yes, on RVP it's a commonly used tactic. But he doesn't really explain, I think, in that what the teaching was.
I think he also contradicts himself at 140 where he says it doesn't form part of the training. I certainly couldn't find it in any of the lesson plans, and it's not a specific mention or anything similar to that within the manual and the other resources.
Yes. So I completely agree with what you're saying, Mr. Graves. So there's that evidence that the chair can consider as part of it. So it may be something that an individual instructor has mentioned. It may not. But in terms of the materials provided, there's nothing in the OST manual, and there was nothing in any of the lesson plans or PowerPoints or anything at all that you were able to find regarding RVPs.
No, I think the comment he makes in relation to it's a general police tactic. Again, it's a part of this experiential learnt process. A supervisor may recommend it. The control room may suggest it, especially if they've got an ARV running. They may ask for a RVP to be set up or to be nominated. So yeah, it's a general thing that would come up, but it's not specifically mentioned within any of the packages or program.
And do you think it would be useful for officers who are, particularly officers who are maybe going to be part of a response team dealing with incidents, to have RVPs and their benefits and the reasons for their use to be part of or mentioned as part of the OST training?
It's certainly something that needs to be discussed and form part of a lesson. Whether that sits specifically within officer safety or some other training program is difficult to say without knowing the full range of training being provided.
But you could see that there would be benefits in all officers knowing about RVPs and when they should be used and why.
Yes, definitely, yes.
Let's look at your report again, please, and go back to if we could go back to page 19. So at the top, please. And I'd like to look at paragraph 3 there. And this is where you talk about the training in 2015 that was available at College of Policing. Can you tell us what the position in 2015 was down in College of Policing?
Again, looking at RVPs, there was an initial input on dealing with critical incidents or major incidents. All officers would have got that as part of their probationary training. As part of that, RVPs would be discussed as an initial action for requirement for emergency services, etc. So it wouldn't be something within officer safety, but it would certainly be within probationary training under that aspect of critical incidents.
So for probationers, there'd be something mentioned about RVPs, so there was an awareness.
Yes.
But for refresher training, would the College of Policing and the forces down there be relying on experience and learning?
Yes, it wouldn't.
On the
It
job?
doesn't form part of officer safety training and wouldn't have appeared in a refresher on that programme.
So in 2015, was the position in Scotland very similar to that in England?
Yes, other than, as I say, I know there was specific probationary training on critical incidents, and I would imagine a similar, although I've not seen it, a similar programme would be in place within Police Scotland.
Thank you. And if we can then move on to look at let's look at question 7 and 8 at the bottom of that page. Can you tell me, in 2022, had the position changed in Police Scotland?
No additional mention of RBPs arrive in the 2022 manual, so I can't see any major change in the approach or the consideration of an RVP. But in this incident, I think with officers searching for an individual, they would have probably, with that experiential learning and lessons learned over the years, I think they would have approached it slightly differently, and they would have located the individual, transmitted that information, and then considered where other support might have needed to come to possibly contain that individual in the locus that he was in.
Thank you. And looking again at the College of Policing and up-to-date position, you've said you've been unable to find any specific input on RVPs within the OST or initial officer training.
Yes, other than what I'd mentioned earlier.
What you mentioned earlier. So really the position hasn't changed in College of Policing either?
No, other than, as I say, there's quite an input now on critical incidents, so that RVPs would appear within that.
Right. Could we look at COP 00020? So this is Emergency Procedures, Initial Response and Operational and Tactical Command, National Policing Curriculum, and this is from January 2024 actually.
Yes, this is the latest updated version from College of Policing.
Update. And could we look at pages 8 and 9 please? So this is Emergency Procedures Initial Responder, and it says learning outcomes on the left, starting with 1, describe what constitutes a major or critical incident and explain the initial response. Is that the type of learning outcome that the person attending the course is expected to be able to answer?
Yes, they're going to be the first responders, so it's their initial actions at the scene, yes, and then how that would develop.
Right. And then where it says minimum content coverage, what do we see under this column?
Basically what the definition is of a critical or a major incident, and then the command structure, how, who would be in charge of it, etc.
So would there be a trainer at College of Policing with this document in front of them?
Yes.
And be checking that the student is able to establish, according to the learning outcomes, the answers to the questions in column on the left?
Yes, that's correct.
And the answers that one would expect to receive from the student will be on the right?
Yes.
Right. So
Well, that's basically the content would be, and they would have to give answers to those particular questions.
And the answers presumably are very much in line with the training that's been given in
Yes.
the course. Could we look on page 9, please, at 3.2? There we are. So question 3 is explain the meaning of interoperability and how it is achieved through effective communication and coordination.
Yes, how we communicate with other emergency services and other organisations.
So interoperability is about the police communicating with third parties.
Yes, that's correct.
3.2, this is one of the answers that would be expected from the student, which is in line with the training that's given at College of Policing. Principles of co-location and coordination. What does that mean?
Basically just where thinking about where they'd actually put it. Was it a suitable location? Is it large enough to take what is going to arrive? It's no good having a small street if we're going to have large fire engines and things like that coming down. Does it have facilities nearby? I mean, it sounds silly. Does it have water? Does it have power? Does it have lighting? So it's about the selection, not just the location, but the suitability of that particular location as to what we needed to take.
So all the specialist resources can function effectively and efficiently.
That's correct, yes.
And bullet point 2 there is functions of a rendezvous point and considerations for the location of a forward command post.
Yes.
And so the student would be expected to be able to answer question 3 by explaining the functions of an RVP and considerations of the location of a forward command post.
Yes.
And is a forward command post linked to the RVP?
It can be, or it may be slightly apart, depending on the type of incident. The forward command post may be away from the RVP, so they've got view of the incident, or for other reasons.
So at the very least, a student attending this training would be expected to have knowledge about RVPs.
Yes, certainly within this COP critical incident training. Yes.
And this is critical incident training for someone who's going to be part of a team responding, a response team.
It's an input for all officers, for new officers. Yes.
Oh, it's an input for all officers on the assumption they will have to respond to an incident
Yes.
at some point. So they are taught about RVPs. Thank you. Thank you. Could we maybe go back to your report, please, on page 19? So that's SBPI 00667, page 19. So we're still on question E, tactical options, and towards the bottom of page 19 we see Roman numeral 2, observe, wait, feedback. And this is one of the tactical options that you were asked to consider. And I think you've looked at the 2015 Police Scotland training.
Yes.
And you've said here at number 1, the 2013 OST manual does not appear to have any specific guidance on this as a tactical option.
No, other than, as I say, the C from the cut mnemonic being create distance, but that's more around the safety aspect of facing a knife.
So the word creating distance, or the words creating distance, are part of cut.
Yes.
But that would very much be subject to individual trainers maybe making the link with observe, wait,
It would be,
feedback.
yes.
Right. And then at paragraph 2, you say standing back or observing should always be a considered option, especially in situations where the risks are high or intervention might inflame the situation. As such, I am surprised not to see this shown as an option for officers under the right circumstances. The lack of this option could require officers to engage in all situations regardless of the risks. I'm interested in what you say here, that you're surprised it's not mentioned in the OST training.
As I said, a lesson plan on this particular subject, I would expect that to be part of the trainer guidance, and to actually raise the benefits of standing back when it's safe to do so. Obviously, always bearing in mind the risk to the public. But in certain circumstances, a person can be observed from a distance. Resources can be sent to different locations to try and contain that individual if they're in an open space, to cover escape routes, etc., before that engagement takes place. So there are benefits of observing individuals, not just in a knife situation, but in a lot of policing situations.
And as I understand observe, wait, feedback, this is about protecting the safety of officers and perhaps members of the public and the subject himself.
It can be, but it's also a tool to gather additional evidence and additional information. So if you can think back to the NDM, we're looking at gathering as much information as we can. So observing an individual, their demeanour, their behaviour, whether or not we actually see the weapon in this situation, could change our assessment of that situation and change how we decide to approach, or if we decide to approach. So it is a very viable tactical option.
And it's about giving time for people to gather in that information and observe what's happening.
Yes.
And presumably, would you agree, the more information you have about a situation, the better able and better equipped you are to deal with that?
Yes, the more information you can get is always going to improve your assessment of the situation.
Thank you. But as you've noted at paragraph 1 there was nothing at all in the 2013 manual about observe, wait, feedback as an option?
No, not particularly within that manual, no.
And I think when we looked at the statement of Graham Patience, and we can go back to that briefly, SBPI 00385, and I read out paragraph 139. And again, that paragraph, he does say, I'm asked if observe, wait, feedback was taught. I would say so, yes. It's not something that would specifically be taught in OST or anything. It's not really applicable to the OST programme.
I would to some degree disagree with that. I think it's a tactical option, so it would be or should be discussed as an option under that subject matter when you're looking at managing conflict or conflict management. Observing is a viable tactical option to gather more evidence, therefore it should appear in a list or a suggested option for officers to deploy.
Would there be any reason not to have it in OST?
Not under those circumstances. As I say, it sits very much within an option for officers to use.
Thank you. And then we can go back to your report, page 19. And if we can move down the page to the bottom, observe, wait, feedback. And if we can look at 3. Let's think about 2015 again, but what the College of Policing were doing at the time. And I think at paragraph 3 you say, stand back and observe was part of the tactical options discussed during College of Policing OST training. And you give a reference to that, and perhaps we could look at PS 00071 on page 12. This forms Appendix D to your report. You've provided these documents to us. So here we are, Appendix D, Item 1. This is College of Policing training materials called Conflict Management. This is page 1, it's the introduction, but I think it's page 12 that you refer to. Yes. And that is page 12, which will be above, yes. If we can move up the way actually, because it's the actual page 12 of the document rather than the PDF page. So that's 13 that we see now.
Yeah, next one.
And this is page 12 of the document. And this has your reasonable officer response options and identify options and contingencies. And you've highlighted that standing back and observing is one of the areas that's covered in this aspect of College of Policing training. Can you identify the section on the page?
Where it says about officer presence there at the bottom, it says an officer may also decide when appropriate to tactically withdraw their presence from the situation. So that's moving away. And this includes the way of the officer approaching the scene, their manner, appearance and professionalism, and the officer's ability to basically observe from a distance is included within this sort of list.
So it's highlighted on the left-hand side, reasonable officer response options.
Yes.
And specifically states that tactically withdrawing is a reasonable officer response.
Yes. I mean, safety being the paramount decision, being able to withdraw from a situation is always a viable option.
And it's indicated under officer's presence and notes that can be done.
Yes.
Thank you. And this is all about, and we see on the left, this is all about Module 2, conflict management.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And can we also, so comparing the Police Scotland 2015 training and what we see here in College of Policing training at that time, similar times, can you express any view on where you think there were issues or areas of concern with the Police Scotland training?
As I said, I haven't seen withdraw or observe as a tactical option within the 2013 Scottish Manual. As I say, I'm aware that it formed part of the training as a tactical option across the rest of the UK. So I'm surprised that those options weren't included as for discussion with officers during training.
What are your concerns about the impact of that on a probationer or a refresher who is being trained?
Well, it could quite possibly sort of push an officer into believing that then they don't have that option, or it's not a viable option that's expected. As I say, tactically withdrawing or running away from something is always an option if it's unsafe to deal with it, whether you're a police officer or not. Obviously, bearing in mind duty of care from officers to the public, you know, it's not the fact that they have to go and rush in and deal with everything.
And thinking now about the current position, if I can summarise it that way, you've said at paragraph 6 on this in relation to this, that in Police Scotland they now do include this as a tactical option in Module 2 of what is the 2022 Police Scotland
That's
OST.
correct. It has been included now as part of the tactical options, yes.
So that's specifically now part of that. And could we look at PS 18537, please? And I believe it's page 26 of a PDF. So this is Module 2 of the current manual, Conflict Management. And I think it's page 26 of the...
So they have observed, contain.
And we see that on the right-hand side, that there's a specific section called Observe, Contain. So that would be akin to observe, wait, feedback.
Yes. And
it says, remember the generic tactical options that may be considered by armed officers that were discussed earlier. So it sounds like this is following on and reinforcing some earlier training.
yeah.
2 of these options, observation and containment, may be viable for use by unarmed officers and staff. Keeping the subject under observation, either overtly or covertly, will assist with the gathering of intelligence and the subsequent deployment of armed officers.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you've been talking about.
That's correct, yeah.
Containment is an option when the subject is known or believed to be in a particular location, the intention being to isolate the subject or place limits on their permitted movement. Where the subject is in possession of a firearm, it is less likely that their movement can be constrained safely by unarmed officers or staff. Where viable, containment may be either static or in some circumstances may move with the subject. It may also allow time for more detailed planning of a police response. When considering this option, consult with the TFC as soon as practicable. Who's the TFC?
I'm not sure in relation to this particular thing.
Right. But it seems that in relation to observe and contain, as it's called here, there is now apparently a specific section providing training in the manual that appears to follow on from earlier training about the same subject, and that is talking about the benefits of observing and also the possibility of containment.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's a change, an up-to-date amendment now.
Yes.
And without really going to this, there's also a Module 18 on edged weapons.
Yes, that's correct.
And you mentioned that it's not directly listed as a tactical option, but again, on page 3 of that module, the cut mnemonic appears, or the principle appears, I should say, and it specifically says, officers and staff should tactically withdraw to a position outside the range of the subject's delivery system and try to observe and contain the subject.
Yes.
So again, specific reference to tactical withdrawal as an option. And again, it appears to be linking back to what we see on this page in Module 2.
That's correct, yes.
And if we go back to your report, which is page 20, page 20, and if we can go down to 7, we see it on the screen, sorry, and you now see that looking at the current Police Scotland training, you think that that is now fit for purpose?
Yes, I believe it is. Yeah.
So these additional instructions and opportunities for training, being as specific as they are, now render it fit for purpose?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. And then you've also gone on to consider recent developments in the College of Policing, and in current times, and I'm interested, could you tell the Chair what the current thinking is down south?
Obviously, there's been a lot of emphasis recently on counter-terrorism training, and we have the run, hide, tell advice, which is for members of the public, but bears for police officers as well. And this all really pushes that safety element of police officers observing subjects or situations to gather the best information and intelligence that they can, and always considering that safety element of their positioning in relation to a subject or a situation.
So is it fair to say that the College of Policing is also now considering counter-terrorism and further advice that can be given in relation
That's
to
correct,
that?
yes.
So is it fair to say this whole area is continuing to evolve and training is improving in this regard?
Yes, across the board in relation to officer safety, yes.
Thank you. Could we go back to page 21? So actually move on from where we currently are and look at verbal dominance. So again, looking at the different tactical options, and the final one of these was Roman numeral 4, and it's called verbal dominance, also known as a hard stop, and identifying the most appropriate option to adopt in any given circumstances. It's recognised this term has associations with armed policing. However, this term has been used in evidence before the inquiry to describe a tactical approach of using dominance and strong verbal commands by unarmed response officers. And the term will be used in that context only. So we're using this in the context of the evidence that we've heard in the inquiry, and we'll call it verbal dominance if we can, but you'll understand the background to that. And if we look at number 1, you say, I've been unable to find any actual input or information on specific tactical option in the documents reviewed. However, during physical elements of the training, the drawing of a piece of equipment and the threat of using it on a subject, such as a baton or spray, before any actual physical force is used, would be taught with strong verbal commands.
Yes.
So although there's nothing specific that you found on any of the training materials from Police Scotland in 2015, you're aware that officers would have been encouraged and instructed to give strong verbal commands, to be clear, to be perhaps loud, and direct those commands towards the subject.
That's correct, yes.
So that is part of their general OST training experience that they would have to get used to.
Yeah, it's combining the verbal commands for compliance with a physical act. So trying to get the two to get the message across to the person that you're dealing with.
And the Chair's heard evidence that not only involved the shouting or a loud voice, but and the tone of voice, but also the language used, and also their body.
Yes, it's
physical commands.
Yeah, it's trying to send the message in as many different ways as you can. So verbally, non-verbally, by your stance, by the drawing of equipment, verbally supporters. So the message is the same. You want them to do something and you want them to do it straight away.
And that is part of OST training.
It is, yes.
Yes. We have the statement from Graham Patience, one of the instructors at round about that time. If we could look at SBPI 00385 again. And if we can look at paragraph 141 this time. I am asked if verbal dominance or a hard stop approach was taught. Again, it's not something that would be applicable to the OST programme, but that would potentially fall into your sort of tactical communication side of things to gain compliance. That would certainly be part of that. On first engagement with a subject, your first attempt would be to try and get verbal compliance. If it's somebody with a knife, you'd hope that that would be enough to get them to put the knife down and comply and gain control after that. So yes, that would definitely be part of it. So Graham Patience was asked if it was part of the training in 2015 for Police Scotland, and he said that it was taught, and he's talking about the use of voice and commands, as you've been
I mean, an
describing.
example of that he's given there would be drop the knife, shouting that at the individual, being assertive with your voice. If you wanted them to get on the floor, get down, get on the floor, but that loud verbal command, looking for the compliance of the subject.
Do you have any thoughts on the comment that he made that it's not something that would be applicable to the OST programme to talk about or teach the verbal dominance or hard stop approach?
He's raised the fact of tactical communication. I would suggest that it could be, it does form part of tactical communication because it's a methodology that can be used to try and gain control of a subject. Various sort of elements of it link into that, but that particular sort of hard stop or verbal dominance isn't specifically highlighted within that section.
I'm interested in this tactical option of we're calling the verbal dominance. In the absence of any specific training or documentation or materials at that time, I'm wondering your views on how officers could identify the limitations of that technique and that tactical option. Because what the Chair has heard is the evidence from officers who talked about wanting control of the situation in 2015. We've heard evidence on day 20 of the hearing from an officer who said the situation was so pressing to get control and the situation needed to be taken control of, firmly taken control of. And so they clearly were aware of the idea of gaining control and gaining compliance. But in the absence of any specific training materials, how could they identify the limitations?
Well, it's quite simply, it might work or it might not work. And if it doesn't work, it's very difficult to then lower the form of communication or soften the form of communication once you've gone to that level. We always teach officers during communication skills, as fact it's easy to escalate from a rapport or a quieter methodology of talking to somebody to escalate that up to a more dominant and assertive manner. But it's very difficult to bring it back down again and have a response, a suitable response from a subject.
If there was specific training about this as a tactical option, do you, in a safe environment in the training room, do you think that those limitations could be more clearly explained to officers?
Yes, I mean it has its place within the options for officers to use, and there are times when I've used it and had to use it in different circumstances. But yeah, a training scenario built around non-responsive subjects, when that tactic is used, would be a viable option, yes.
And do you think there'd be benefit in having training for probationers and refresher training in relation to this tactical option?
Yes, I mean, as I said, it's an option that's used quite a lot. You only got to watch any of the police programmes on TV and you see them going through a front door and it's the first thing you hear is officers shouting commands and shouting orders at people. So it's a well-used tactic across the policing environment. So I think recognising that and giving officers guidelines in relation to how it works, and when it might not work would be beneficial, yes.
And of course, as well as their own experience, of which may be very varied, whether probationers or officers with years service, they're bombarded with police dramas, detective dramas, where officers are shouting and pulling their guns and all sorts of equipment. And do you think training would have a place in explaining the benefits of tactical communication, maybe at a quieter, more communicative level? Yeah,
I mean, the tactical communication input now is far greater than it used to be. but I still think there's space at the end of that for, we talk about crisis communication or verbal dominance. It really needs to just be explained a little bit more, and certainly the pitfalls of using it inappropriately or in the wrong set of circumstances. The fact it's not a one size fits all. If you apply that to everything, it won't always work.
Thank you. And then if we can go back to your report, please. And we're looking at verbal dominance, which is page 21. I'd like to look at the final paragraph on that page. And you say, as the training did not specifically mention this tactical option within OST, then I would have to say no. And this is where you're asked the question of whether the training for Police Scotland in 2015 was fit for purpose. So your view on that is that it was not fit for purpose because you simply couldn't find any actual training on this as a tactical option.
Yes.
And you say, however, across the UK, this was a well-used tactical option which under the right circumstances can be very effective. Where the level of risk or threat is considered high, then officers may decide to deploy tactics designed to verbally overpower and control a subject. And this might include shouting or making threats with equipment drawn. And this is designed to mentally overwhelm the subject and cause them to hesitate, basically scare them into submission and hopefully comply with the directions being given. And this is used as an alternative to actual physical force and should be seen as a less intrusive option than, say, strikes or the use of an irritant spray. So you're not wanting to suggest for any moment that this would not remain a tactical option for officers?
No, definitely not. I mean, say it's a very viable option. I just think guidance, well, firstly, acceptance that it is a tactical option is important, but then also guidance on the best way in the circumstances that it might be applicable to.
And perhaps an understanding of where it sits within the range of tactical options.
Yes.
From the communication right up until the most serious type of tactical options.
Yeah, well, if you look at the situation as we are at the moment, if you put it in with tactical communication, it would be at the very early stages. But however, the use of that may be when the level of resistance is higher or the threat perception from the officer is much higher, and that's where that verbal dominance would probably come in.
Thank you very much. Could you give me a moment? I wonder if that would be an appropriate time to...
We'll stop for 20 minutes. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Before the break, Mr. Graves, we were talking about question E and Roman numeral 4, which was all about verbal dominance. And we'd discussed issues regarding 2015 training. And I wonder if we could also, training in Police Scotland, I wonder if we can now look at College of Policing training on the matter. If we look at paragraph 3 of your report, so this is, we're on page 22, I think. And if we look at paragraph 3, which is towards the top of the page, and you say the training across the rest of the UK in relation to this was only discussed during taser, public order and firearms training, which not all officers received. It did not form part of the initial OST input. The only mention of this type of tactical option is on pages of Module 6 Communication in the NPCC OST manual and under Crisis Communication. And I wondered if we can perhaps look at that. So COP 00031. And you talk about pages 44 and 45.
Yes, it's right at the end of the section.
Right, well, I think there may be some issue. I wonder if we could look at PS 00079. That might be an alternative. If that's... no. Oh, there it is. So this is Module 6, which I think is the communication module.
Yes.
And this is an excerpt from the Appendix D, which you provided to the inquiry.
Originally, yes.
And it's item 9, so it'll be part of a larger module.
Yes.
But would this contain the pages that...
Should do. If you
it
go
should.
to the end of that document, it should be
Let's-
some of the last pages in that document.
Thank you. Let's do that. So that may be 40... If we go right to the end...
Oop.
That's 47 is
Yeah,
the
go up
final
to
page.
44, 45.
Do you want to look at 44,
There we go.
45?
Go up a bit.
Let's see.
So,
I don't... Sorry, I didn't see the page number of that.
yeah,
so
so it's just slightly the next page up. Sorry, rather than down. It starts with the next page up, I believe.
45 is the
yeah.
next
So
page
That's it.
up.
That's Christ.
Do you want to look at 44 first?
Yeah, if you go up to
since you
44, it
mentioned
starts on there. It starts right at the bottom of 44.
Crisis communication. Occasionally, officers may need to use loud, repetitive verbal commands as a means of controlling the individual.
Yes.
So that's what we've been talking about. And then let's look at the next page. I think we see a photograph with the body language that displays a command.
Yeah.
And it's important to realise that simple language with short phrases should be used as a determined individual or non-English speaking individual may fail to understand complicated messages. Similarly, the officer may not be able to physiologically mouth complicated words due to the stress of the situation.
Yes. Keep it simple, basically.
Keep it simple and short. And then, whilst crisis communication may be naturally heard by subjects, it also assists in alerting colleagues, enabling witnesses to corroborate what an officer is saying, breaking through auditory barriers the subject may have. That means if they're slightly deaf,
Yeah.
perhaps. Increasing the justification for use of force by the officers, gaining control if commands are not complied with. And then there's a box talking about before physical engagement. So before there's any contact or use of force, stop, get back, stay back. And there may be similar derivatives that officers personally use.
Yes.
And they would be included within that as well.
Yeah.
So does this really sum up the type of communication training that was being given by College of Policing
This
at
this
the
is
time?
the last part of the communication module, and it said it looks specifically at dealing with those high stress situations where you need to limit the communication style and simplify it so that individuals can have an opportunity to comply.
And so if this is at the end of what the College of Policing were training at the time, what was at the beginning? 'Cause
It
this is-
starts about, looks at de-escalation techniques, different forms of communication, verbal, non-verbal communication, looking at verbal cues in relation to signs of aggression, looking at different types of influences on communication, things that can change a person, barriers to communication, etc. So it looks really much at the communication as a skill, and then goes on to the more simplistic methodologies of communication in high stress situations.
Is it fair to say from what you're describing, obviously this is simply an excerpt, that considerable time is spent in a number of pages covering communication
Well,
before getting to the verbal dominance?
as you can see there, it's 45, 46 pages on communication.
And it's only at the end that they get to verbal dominance?
Yes.
Thank you. And can you tell us, do you have any thoughts on the approach that was being taken in 2015 or round about that time by College of Policing compared to the approach being taken at that same time by Police Scotland?
I think there was a recognition that there are situations where officers have to use that type of forceful or assertive language, an acknowledgement that it is a widely used tactical option in certain circumstances. So I think that acknowledges that particular part of the policing training.
And in terms of the fact that College of Policing had 40-odd pages of training on tactical communications compared to the position in Scotland, do you have any reflections on that?
I've always seen it as the primary control skill in any situation. It's a very important skill for officers to be able to master. You've got to practice it to get better at it. So yes, it's always formed part of the delivery of OST across the UK and is a primary tactical option.
So, although I think in your report you say there's no specific training within OST as part of College of Policing, that is the area that you've noticed there is
Yes,
some
that
specific.
was what would align itself to that hard, assertive, forceful communication style.
Thank you. And then looking at more up-to-date training that's available, I think in paragraph 6, if we go back to your report, page 22, you say, I still don't see any specific mention of it, if that's the verbal dominance tactical option, in the current manual being used within Police Scotland, or any of the lesson plans related to OST. So would your position on that again be subject to other training that's perhaps available in Police Scotland? You could find nothing specific about verbal dominance as a tactical option, even up to the most recent materials you've
Not
looked at.
specifically in the 2022 manual, which was the one I reviewed, yes.
And although it may be mentioned elsewhere in other training, do you see a place for it being mentioned in OST training for new officers?
As I've said previously, it is a tactical option that can be used. It is widely used by officers across the country. I think acknowledging that and giving officers guidance on when it might be suitable and when it might not be suitable to use, and the implications of using it, it is a beneficial input, yes.
And so let's look at what is said about tone of voice and such like in the 2022 OST manual, and we'll look at Module 3 on tactical communications. The number I have is PS 18538. It may be that that's... I know 3.7 is Module 2, and I have 3.8 for Module 3. Well, while we wait for that, I think I can read out on page 3 that there is some training about communication is an interaction between two or more people, with all participants having an active role in the process, and there are 3 main components, and one of those that's mentioned is vocal.
Yes.
Tone, volume, intonation, pitch and pace make up 38% of the total message.
It's a communication model specifically looking at communication during conflict situations, looking at the majority of the message being non-verbal, so it's how you're standing, how you're looking. 38% of it being the vocal, how you deliver it, not what you say, but how you say it. And then only 7% of the message getting across is actually the words being spoken.
And actually I see that the number is completely different to the one I had in my papers, but nevertheless Module 3 Tactical Communications is now on the screen. This is the 2022 manual.
Yes.
And if we could look at page 3, I think we see giving out, and I've just read a section from that. So it's page 3. Components of communication, and the vocal section is what I just read out.
Yeah.
And there's also a taking in section. Just like the subject, information is taken in through your eyes and ears. Whilst tactical communication is improved by training and knowledge, the subject's abilities to give out and take in information are more likely to be affected by drink, drugs, mental state, behavioural patterns, some learned and some instinctive, and disabilities that impact on these skills. And these elements are classified as impact factors, warning signs, and danger signs.
Yes, I would say they're barriers to communication, and we discuss that through the training in relation to what can affect how the message is received, or how that other person can then communicate back.
So there can be a number of barriers to the subject taking in what's being said or communicated or shouted.
Yeah, not just taking it in, but also processing that message in the way that you've intended it to go across. So the possibility of misunderstanding or getting the wrong message is heightened as well through those barriers.
So not just hearing, but comprehending.
Yes.
Thank you. And looking at that training as it exists now in 2022, both in relation to what we've seen here, which is Officer Safety Training Module 3, but in relation to Police Scotland training, in relation to communicating, and also the verbal dominance element of that, do you think there's merit in improving the training in that area?
The section is greatly improved on the 2015 manual. What I couldn't establish from the programme was how much emphasis is placed on this particular subject. It would have been nice to be able to find sort of how much time, certainly from the refresher, how much time is given to it in relation to delivery, because it is such an important part of the toolbox.
And in your opinion, how much time should be spent on tactical communications, which would include verbal dominance, but to the perhaps lower level of tactical communication?
I mean, if you think of the new processes of scenario-based training, it's a woven thread throughout all of them. you have to be able to communicate with the individual within the scenario. So the manner and the format of your communication is tested on every single scenario. The suitability of the tone, intonation, and the words used can be challenged or can be rewarded. So it's far better format to be able to actually look at officers and how they communicate with subjects.
So, although you've set out your views in relation to this aspect, the one area where you were not able to gain as much information as you would have liked was the actual time that is spent on this.
Yes, I mean, obviously the manual reflects to new officers, so new officers will be getting an input based on this section. What I wasn't able to establish was how much time was actually being allocated to that during refresher training, or whether it was something that was just being linked into the training, which may be specialising or focusing on the physical skills again.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now. We could perhaps go back to your report, please. And I'd like to return to question C. And this is on page 15. And you'll remember that the initial focus of my questioning, Mr. Graves, has been in relation to the areas where you found no training materials, or there was, as you put it, little of note. And that was A, B, and E, and in particular Roman numerals 1, 2, and 4. And I'd like to move on to the areas where you have been able to identify training for Police Scotland. So if we could start by looking at C on page 15, which is carrying out a dynamic risk assessment. Do you have that?
Yes.
And we're looking at this aspect. We've heard evidence about a dynamic risk assessment. Looking at this aspect, you were able to identify training that was given by Police Scotland in 2015.
That's correct, yes.
And you say in paragraph 1 that this was held within the 2013 manual, module 1, section 5. This is brief and should be linked to impact factors and more information under person, object, place. I've previously criticised the definition of conflict shown on page 9, on page 5 of my report, and I think you gave evidence about that yesterday.
Yes, you just need to go to the bottom of the page that's currently being shown.
And I would also suggest that confrontational considerations is not part of this process and should be shown elsewhere in the manual. So, sorry, we should, if we can look at C on the screen, on page 15 at the bottom, there we are. Sorry, I didn't realise that wasn't displayed. So, you've talked here about what is in the 2013 manual about dynamic risk assessment. And maybe we could look at that briefly. So it's PS 10938, and we're looking at Module 1, Section 5. And we looked at Module 1 yesterday, that's the Officer Safety Training module.
Yeah.
And Section 5 of that. And you specifically mention person, object, place, which is on page 10. I will need to keep going, please. If we look at page...
The top of that page, 10.
Top of this page, please. So this is page 10, Module 1, Section 5. And we see definition, threat assessment means accurately assessing, and POP is there, person, objects, places. Yep. And you say you'd criticised the definition of conflict, and you gave us evidence about that yesterday. So can you talk us through any concerns you have with this training that existed at the time? So the dynamic risk assessment training.
Certainly the content within this particular module is very disjointed. The initial information on conducting a risk assessment is very brief, just a couple of paragraphs from memory. And is then disjointed from information like this, and then information later on in the section in relation to warning signs or danger signs. What I would have expected is again, going back to what I said yesterday, a logical approach to that particular element of the NDM. So again, we haven't seen the NDM yet because it's at the end of the section. But if you put the NDM up and we're looking at that assessing threat and risk, it's the how do I do it and what do I need to look at and how and what elements do I need to consider to conduct that assessment. So at the moment, or based on the manual as it was in 2013, that isn't clear with the information that's being provided. And when you look at the lesson plans, again, it doesn't follow a logical approach. It talks about, basically follows exactly the format as it is in the manual. So I find it very disjointed, brief in places, not giving full descriptions and advice on the wheres and the hows. So again, it could have been much better laid out and following the NDM as the thing to hang it on, basically the methodology.
And you talked about the NDM yesterday, and we found that at page 18 of Module 1.
Yes.
And let's just have that on the screen for a moment just to refresh everyone's memory here. That's page 18 of the manual, so that's page 13.
So that was what I was talking about, the danger cues. That's on page 13.
Yeah. And here we are, National Decision-Making Model. And we see the first stage is gather information, which we talked about. Second stage is assess threat and risk and develop a working strategy. And you talked about that yesterday. And then I think if we look at page 9 of the Module 1, so that's 17, and if we can go back to 9, we do see the start of section 5. It's page 15. We're looking for page 9. There we are. And so Module 1, Section 5 is about threat assessment. But this comes before you even see the NDM picture image.
Yes.
And there's talk of confrontational considerations.
Yes, and I don't consider that part of the threat assessment process. It's a preparation model that is used, called Cooper's Colour Codes. It's something that's discussed as part of preparing for policing or preparing for duty. It doesn't really form part of the threat assessment process. It has a bearing, but I don't think it's the fundamental opening statement that you want to be looking at. You want to be looking at what is a threat, what is risk, how do I identify it, how do I assess it, and that really doesn't basically fit in that particular section.
So in terms of communicating effectively the NDM process to people, students, that isn't where you would start.
No.
And it says specifically preparation for policing at the bottom of the page on the left-hand column, just under the confrontational considerations. If you keep going, we'll see preparation. So it does identify preparation rather than actually carrying out a threat assessment. And then the right-hand side, you'll see a section that says threat assessment, conflict in general. There we are. And then the next page, page 10, which you specifically addressed earlier, gives the definition person, objects, places.
Yes.
And risk colours. No other sort of details on that page.
No.
Regarding that aspect of the NDM. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, so what I would have expected there is you've explained person, object, place, but what you haven't gone into is any detail in relation to each of those subject matters. So if I'm delivering that, I'm looking at the person, so then what in relation to the person do I need to be looking at? Not just their actions and demeanour. I want to be looking at things like size, numbers, abilities, things like what am I seeing, what do I know about this individual? They're all factors that will affect my assessment of the level of risk that this individual poses to me and my colleagues or the public. Objects, again, examples of different types of objects, what sort of risks they can thing. So not just talking about weapons. Are they in a vehicle? Do they have a dog on a lead? Have they got a push bike with them? All of these things can cause problems. And then the place, the environment, looking at, is it confined space? Am I up a flight of stairs? Looking at all these different aspects of the location at which I've decided or I end up having to deal with this individual. So there's lots of information in that person-object place, but none of it is held in there. It's just basically thrown out as a mnemonic and then not really followed up with the supporting information.
Of course, we're looking at the 2013 manual, which is the core document.
Yes.
But other materials that you've looked at in relation to training at the time, so was there anything more detail provided in lesson plans?
Nothing
or
within
other
the lesson
areas?
plans that I've seen, but there was some additional information included in some of the PowerPoint presentations. There was one from that time, but the other presentation that I was given was dated post this event. So that was better, but it was post the 2015 period that we're looking at.
All right, thank you. And then we have a statement from Inspector Young, SBPI 00153. And I'd like to look at paragraphs 52 to 55. So he was asked about risk assessment and training provided to officers by way of a dynamic risk assessment in 2014-2015. He said, I couldn't tell you how many minutes or hours were spent on this, but there was an input on threat assessment and what we call risk categories during their 3-hour OST theory input. Now, what you'll see in the manual is a reference to threat assessment. We talk about what's known as confrontation considerations, i.e. what will have or what could have a direct effect on an officer falling victim of an assault. So that's the officer's mindset or the mindset of the individual, their own tactics, their own skills. The main thing is that we talk about risk assessment primarily around about officer safety considerations, and that threat assessment and the risk is posed by persons during a conflict situation as opposed to a threat assessment, a risk assessment about travelling on a road or going into a house. And then he goes on to say, we did cover it in Module 1, Section 5, which we've just been looking at.
Yes.
And he discusses the threat assessment. 54, he talks about OST differs significantly from what is taught in threat and risk assessment in, for instance, firearms and public order. So I think in that area, if there's an officer trained in firearms or public order, the training is quite different, he appears to be saying. And then at 55, to assist with that assessment of threat and risk, we taught officers to actively assess what we called the ICI, or the identity, capability and intent of the subject. And he talks about that, and I think there was reference to that in Module 1, Section 5 that we had on the screen a moment ago. So if we can go back to your report for a moment, again we're looking at Section 2, it starts at the bottom of page 15. At the bottom of page 15, and it says, in my opinion, it is lacking in clarity. This is the 2015 Police Scotland training. Lacking in clarity and operational examples to aid officers in its application. This may lead to hesitation by officers in stressful situations. The process should follow the natural cognitive process of decision making. I do not believe that how this is laid out in the manual provides this. And that's a reference back to your concerns about the national decision making model appearing on page 18 at the end.
Yes.
But if we look at the beginning of paragraph 2, you talk about lacking in clarity and operational examples. What type of detail or operational examples would you have expected to be in the manual?
So talking through the NDM as an example for them to look at, what I would have expected, or I would see within the lesson plans, as an example of possibly running an officer through a particular scenario, so that further information or further risks become evident during a situation. How does that impact on their assessment of the risk? A simple analogy or a simple exercise could be the fact of non-compliance from a subject. So, you give a description of an individual, you turn up and the description is incorrect. The person is larger build. There are 3 of them there. How would that impact on your assessment of your initial assessment of the risk? And I think going back to the statement, the difference between a dynamic risk assessment and what could be classed as a risk assessment under health and safety, the process is the same. It's just done in a much quicker time, and you haven't got the luxury of taking in as much or considering as much information. So you're looking at simplistic ways of officers to be able to look at the person, the objects of available, etc., and in the vicinity, and where they're dealing with this individual. So giving them practical examples of how that can change and how that would then impact the assessment is an important tool to be able to give them, to be able to do that in quick time within a situation.
Right, thank you. And is that something that could be developed in scenario-based training?
Yeah, I mean, it can form part of the actual, just the delivery of the, discussed about the 3-hour knowledge input or the 3-hour theory input. As part of that, giving them examples or possibly showing them bits of video, and getting them to assess an individual, a photograph, etc.
So it would be open to an individual trainer to give specific examples
when
themselves?
It's not dictated within a lesson plan or within a learning outcome, then yes, it would be down to how the individual trainer decided to put that across. Also, what I wasn't able to find was whether or not that still formed part of the refresher training, because again, the refresher training seemed to be heavily favoured towards the physical skills and not a repeat of the theory elements such as communication, risk assessment, application of the NDM through that refresher.
Thank you. And then if we move on to paragraph 3, this is where you talk about the difference with what was being done with College of Policing at that time in around 2015. And can you explain to the Chair what was happening down in England?
Well, as I say, the conflict management section, certainly within the 2012 manual, within the rest of the UK, had been laid out to incorporate and follow the NDM. So when we got to that section in relation to threat assessment, all of the relevant information that officers may require to conduct that assessment is held in a logical format. So we talk about person, object, place. We talk about the warning signs and the comparisons that officers may need to take into consideration. They're also presented in a nice, simple one-page sort of aid memoir, shall we say, for them to be able to reflect on and look at, to be able to conduct those assessments. So the way it was laid out was far more far clearer and far more user-friendly from that period.
And I think in paragraph 3 you also note the volume, that there's 3 extensive pages, very extensive pages of conflict management in module 2 of the College of Policing materials, compared to what we've looked at in relation to Police Scotland.
Yes.
And
as I said about the conflict and the confrontational considerations, that doesn't form part of conflict management within the NPC manual. It's actually in the what we call a personal management, because it's about an officer's preparation and their mindset in relation to policing. So it's not part of confrontation handling.
right. And do you see a benefit in the type of training that College of Policing were providing in 2015 compared to Police Scotland?
I think considering that that training at that time had undergone a massive review, and the manual itself had taken nearly 3 years to revamp and review. I think it has the benefit of that review process having been taken place, so it was therefore far better fit for purpose or equipped to assist officers.
Thank you. And then if you can move on to 2022, can you bring us up to date with Police Scotland's training in relation to the dynamic risk assessment?
Yeah, as I've said now, it's much better explained in the 2022 manual. It has actually now been fully incorporated. The NDM takes sort of primacy at the beginning of that section. The additional information is laid out in a far more methodical way, and it actually follows the NDM process. And as I said, it's much better than the old section within the 2013 manual.
And I think you say that the NDM now takes centre stage.
Yes, that's correct.
And I think that the Chair has a statement from Inspector Bradley, and I won't put that on the screen at the moment, but he has also in SBPI 00408 at paragraphs 83 onwards given the Chair considerable information about the detailed training that's now available to Police Scotland. And a number of documents appear to cover the issue of dynamic risk assessment. So you say at paragraph 7 that you believe that this is the current situation, is far more in keeping with current good practice and training in NDM dynamic risk assessment across the rest of the UK.
Yes, I would.
So do you think that it's in a much better position now than it was?
Yes. I mean, putting the NDM as the centre requirement and then hanging the rest of the information off that is exactly how it should be presented.
And you provided the Chair with appendices D, E and F, which you've attached to your report, which show the current position for College of Policing.
Yes, they're current documents in relation to conflict resolution, in relation to dynamic risk assessment and the application of the NDM.
Excellent. And I think you've also, in one of the documents, and I won't go to that at this stage, but you say it states there is a growing recognition that using force and restraining people who are in mental health crisis, experiencing acute behaviour disturbance, or suffering from drug or substance-induced psychosis can pose a life-threatening risk, and officers and staff may need to adjust how they interact with people with communication difficulties and consider how people may perceive and respond to their presence, attitudes and demeanour of the police. So is there a growing recognition, certainly that seems to be what's stated in College of Policing materials, that officers need to be more aware of communicating with people with mental health issues?
It's become more prominent in policing. As I say, go back as far as sort of 2007, 2009. It's been an ongoing thread that has increased as our knowledge has improved, as recommendations and cases unfortunately have become apparent. It's allowed us to develop that training and improve that awareness across the force.
And it would appear from the College of Policing materials that you provided to us that mental health crisis, it may be someone experiencing ABD, or they may be someone experiencing drug-induced psychosis or some sort of substance-induced psychosis.
Yes, it's not so much what is the problem, it's just identifying that there is the problem and treating it accordingly.
We've heard evidence in the inquiry that the police say they're not doctors and they're not in a position to diagnose the cause of any symptoms or unusual behaviour in someone, and presumably you would accept that.
Yes, recognise the behaviour, not the cause for the behaviour.
And is the training now very much focused at recognising the behaviour and how best the police should communicate?
Yes, it's looking at the signs of the risks, understanding the risk factors incorporated, and looking at different methodologies of dealing and controlling that risk.
And so, in effect, it doesn't really matter whether it was drugs or alcohol or mental health. It's about how the police can best communicate with the person.
Yes, it shouldn't matter what the cause is. It's about identifying the fact that an individual is in crisis of some description, and then looking at the alternative solutions. It still doesn't mean that the officers may not have to intervene, depending on the safety of the individual and others, but it does give them that underlying knowledge of the risks of that interaction and how they can best limit those risks.
And I think that leads nicely into question D, which is, if we look back at section 4, that might be useful to have that on the screen. So that's page 12. And you'll see that the fourth question, D, is identification of subjects who are intoxicated, experiencing mental health crisis, suffering from ABD or ED, and actions then to be taken.
Yes. And
so the inquiry team asked you specifically to identify the training that was provided, first of all, in 2015, in relation to this topic. And I think if we move on to page 16 of your report, we can see what you said about that. And that's towards the end of that page. There we are. And we'll see in paragraph 1 there that you said within the training materials relevant in 2015, which is the 2013 manual, this area is given minimal input and some of the information is dated. The communication module mentions alcohol and drugs, but only has 1 paragraph and little in the way of advice. There does not appear to be a section on communicating with someone in a mental health crisis or overcoming these barriers to communication. So, did you have concerns when you looked at the training materials that were available?
Yes, I did.
And I think in paragraph 2 you say your view is that it was not fit for purpose.
No, I don't think it was.
And you said, without evidence of substantial additional input, the training appears to provide officers with almost no coping strategies or advice on how to firstly identify someone under the influence or suffering from a mental health crisis, ABD or ED, and then how to attempt communication and control of such subjects. This would leave officers to utilise their personal skills when dealing with incidents involving these issues.
That's correct, yes.
Now, do you think that this type of issue does properly sit within OST training?
I think it does. I think it's a relevant area that should have a great deal of importance placed upon it because of the risk factors of injury and possible death. The emphasis certainly across the rest of the UK has increased massively over the last sort of 10 years. And I think there are a lot of good bits of work that have been going on. I'm aware of some work that actually went on in Scotland about 3 or 4 years ago, which are looking and trying to improve officers' knowledge and understanding of this particular subject.
But certainly from your view of 2015 and the areas that you've looked at, so, and it would not just be the manual, there'd be the instructor's manual, there'll be lesson plans perhaps, or that may mention alcohol or drugs. There may have been PowerPoint presentations that you've looked at. But having looked at all of that, do you think this really did not provide adequate skills to a student who had to face identifying a subject who was subject to these?
As I say, the training materials are minimal. There's mention of them, but there's no supporting information in relation to how do I deal with this if I believe the person is under the influence or is suffering a crisis. As I said, going back to work elsewhere, you mentioned yesterday the DVD that the Met Police produced specifically around mental health. that goes back to sort of 2007. We have the inputs and the sections within the NPCC manual from 2012, which greatly increased the awareness and knowledge, signs and symptoms of ABD, and also the coping strategies for officers to consider. So there's a lot more information, a lot more emphasis on it within the manual, and I think that should be replicated within the Police Scotland resources.
Now, it may be suggested that in Scotland, many adults will have witnessed people who are intoxicated for one reason or another, drink or drugs, substances of some kind, or that may be suffering from mental health problems. And the police would be in no worse position than anyone else to be able to identify that. They would be equally good as a layperson, a citizen going about their business. And certainly a civilian would be able to identify someone who was drunk in the street as well as anyone else. Civilians wouldn't need special training for that. But do you think that police are in a different position?
I think, first of all, not to understand that not everybody who is intoxicated or has taken drugs or is having a mental health crisis is susceptible to the possibility of ABD. The definition as it stands, it's about that bizarreness or that unusual behaviour that is outside of the norm that may indicate that that individual is suffering that type of situation. But it's in relation to police officers, they have a duty of care to that individual and also a duty to protect the public. So they have a duty to interact and try to resolve the problem whilst looking at the safety of the individual and the subject themselves. So there is an increased requirement for officers to have a better awareness, to have a better understanding of what is happening, and also how to best try and manage the risk, because there is a risk regardless of how we look at it, how to limit and control that risk to the best of their abilities if they do have to interact with this individual.
So an average citizen could cross the road and walk away?
Yeah, basically, yes.
But it may be required for a police officer to communicate and engage with that individual?
That's correct, yes.
So further training for an officer may be of benefit?
Yes, it would be, yes.
And you talked earlier about regardless of whether the cause is drink or drugs or some substance or mental health, you mentioned a medical emergency. And is that really what the training is designed to help the police do? Identify?
That is one of the crux messages, certainly from the College of Policing training. It's quite a simple mnemonic: ABD equals A&E. That's what we tell officers is ABD. So if we suspect that somebody is suffering from ABD, they go to A&E because it's a medical emergency. The likelihood of them needing a medical intervention is quite high. So we talk about that, and we talk about the methodologies of then getting them to the A&E. Do we go in police transport? Do we go in ambulance transport? If we go in ambulance transport, do the police go with them? If we go in police transport, does the ambulance crew come with you to allow to provide medical assistance? So there's all of those things that are ways of reducing or trying to reduce the risk of that individual suffering a cardiac arrest or going into medical distress.
And in terms of the training in Police Scotland in 2015, was there clarity about police officers should, if they spot the signs of ABD, or as it was known then,
Excited
ED,
delirium, yeah.
that was a medical emergency and should be treated as such?
Nothing specific that I found. It certainly they don't use that mnemonic or that sort of correlation. But there is comment that it could become a medical emergency. But I think it's identifying the fact that it could be a medical emergency at the very early stage and getting that information, into the officer's psyche, which would allow for medical intervention at an earlier stage or as early as possible.
So, but no reference to the mnemonic that you've given us, ABD equals A&E?
No.
Could we look at page 24 of the Module 1 Officer Safety Training, which is PS 10938. So this is the 2013 manual. And page 24 of the actual manual is about excited delirium. It's section 12. Page 24. Thank you. So this is Module 1 of the 2013 manual, section 12, and it's specifically about excited delirium and what it is. And if we look at the bottom of the page on the right-hand side, so actions to reduce the risk of death in restrained subject exhibiting excited delirium. So it was recognised that death could occur.
Yes.
If someone was suffering from this. And at the bottom it does say, any subject exhibiting symptoms of excited delirium should be treated as a medical emergency and be assessed immediately at a hospital.
Yes. If we look at the earlier paragraphs, it very much looks at individuals who are being restrained, or indicates to officers that this is something that will happen whilst being restrained. Whilst that increases the risk, what it doesn't identify, if we go up the page a little bit, please. If we look at the how to identify it, how do officers identify a subject in a state of excited delirium? The main thing here is what I said before. It's about the bizarre behaviour and the demeanour of the individual, rather than things that will only become apparent while an officer is using force or restraining that individual. I don't know if they're strong until I actually try to get hold of them and do something to them. I don't know if they've got a high tolerance to pain unless I try pain compliance techniques upon them. I don't know if they're going to not respond to incapacitance spray unless I use it on them. So none of that indicates to me early recognition of somebody with ABD or excited delirium is paramount. So this section very much to me looks like if you have gone to restrain an individual, this is what you might find. By that, it's a bit late by then, because you want that early identification to be able to say, this person is in crisis, this person may be suffering ABD, therefore I need medical assistance, I need to consider my options. Or am I going to go hands-on? If I am going to go hands-on, how can I reduce the risk of this getting worse? So it seems to be an afterthought in relation to the actual comments, rather than a very stringent, let's identify this early, let's understand what we're seeing and what we're dealing with, and try and put things in place before we go hands-on, rather than looking for the ticks in the boxes once we have gone hands-on.
And so, again, superficially in relation to the order, identifying a medical emergency should be the first step.
Yeah.
Before any use of force at all.
As I say, understanding that that person is their behaviour is bizarre or unusual, and as such, linked with the other information that we've got. It could be things. I mean, indications and things like body is hot to the touch, the skin is hot to the touch. Again, I wouldn't know that until I actually took hold of the person. But if the person is running around in the middle of winter with no shirt on, that's a sign that they may be hot, not the fact that their skin's hot to the touch. So it's just about the emphasis and how the information's put across doesn't really lend itself to early identification of excited delirium.
So there are early opportunities for officers, but you would suggest from what you're saying that the training should be designed to help officers find out what those early opportunities are, and that maybe someone's running around without a jacket or a shirt, and allow them to identify a medical emergency before they even lay hands on the person.
Yes, hopefully that's what you're looking for. It doesn't always happen that way, but yes, that's what you're hoping can occur.
And that's not something that we see in relation to this?
Not in relation to how this information, this one page of information is presented, no.
Thank you. And you then in your report go on to compare what College of Policing were doing in 2015 And I'm very interested in going back to your report at this stage, if we may. And I think that's really towards the bottom of page 16 and on to page 17, and you've given a lot of details. Could you perhaps explain to the chair, and if you go on to page 17, you'll see a lot of the detail that you provided. Could you help the chair understand what College of Policing were doing in 2015?
Yes, as I've stated there was going back to communication that we looked at earlier. There were specific tips in relation to how to overcome barriers within the communication section. So we looked specifically at persons who were suffering mental health. So tips were given in relation to things like making sure your radio was turned down, only one person to communicate directly with the individual, things like take your hat off, make it more personal, just simple little tips that officers could follow to try and assist that communication process with somebody who was in a mental health crisis.
And you've mentioned the video that was prepared, which we see here, Considerations for Safer Restraint, Pucka Films 2006. So was that a training video that was available from then?
It was. I say it was produced by the Met. I was one of the sort of co-producers and editors of it. It looked at APD, but wanted to specifically heighten officers' awareness of how to deal with persons in mental health crisis. The video also had very kind interviews with two mental health service users, so two people who were suffering from mental health issues, and they were giving their personal interpretations of how their interactions with police officers had gone in the past, and also what they would like to see as being on the receiving end, shall we say, of police actions, what they would like to see happen. So it was a very good sort of educational process. But it also looked at, basically a reenactment of a person in the street suffering a mental health crisis, being approached by two officers, and how those officers communicate and try to calm that individual so that they can take them away.
And from your experience as a trainer, what benefits were there for students to watching the video? Because we've also heard some evidence about the benefits of videos and film as a mechanism for sharing and training, which perhaps aids comprehension.
Yes, it does, and it also standardises the input, so you're not then reliant upon different trainers having a methodology of putting that message across. By having a particular training video or on restraint or on this type of subject matter, it allows all officers to be made aware of those situations. Another good part of that particular video, I'm not sort of bragging about it, but officers who had dealt with an ABD, and unfortunately that ABD had ended in a death. The officers who were actually involved give their interpretations and their views on how it happened, why it happened, but also just how it had affected them in relation to they weren't expecting it, they didn't understand it, they weren't aware of what it was. And again, that was to assist officers maybe having to deal with, or we're going to deal with similar incidents.
So from a well-being perspective
Yes.
as well, was that useful?
Yes.
And we talked yesterday very briefly about realism and the importance of realism in training for officers and scenario-based training. Did the video aid training in that respect to show maybe something that's more realistic than your colleagues pretending?
Yeah, yes, I mean, it was. We did it out in the public. We did it in the public domain. It was in front of some shops. So it was to try to make it look as realistic as possible. The two officers that were involved were police officers. They were trainers. The person who was being the person in mental health crisis was an actor. So we showed it as this is a good way of dealing with it. This is possibly not such a good way of dealing with it, and showed the pluses and minuses of both sort of approaches. But also covered then, as I said earlier, the issues about getting the ambulance running nice and early, and then if restraint is required, then how do we transport that individual to the hospital? Do we go in the ambulance, etc., and things to look for and things to consider during that process.
So a mechanism, really a way of demonstrating a good way of handling a situation where someone has been suffering from a mental health crisis, demonstrated by trainers with
Yes.
the use of actors. And is this the video that you mentioned yesterday that was provided to Strathclyde, a legacy force?
Yes, I mean, it was disseminated, it was offered out through the national network, through the national committee. I have personal recollection of Strathclyde taking a copy of it to assist in their training, and a number of other forces up and down the country using it as well.
And I would like to play a section of this video, obviously subject to there may be some redactions because of personal data, but it's the full video takes 19 minutes.
Yes.
And I'm conscious of the time, but I wonder if the chair would permit us to maybe rise slightly.
Yes, well,
early.
we'll stop for lunch now and sit at 2 o'clock.